By early 1969, the Beatles were at a crossroads. The group, as they'd done with the White Album, had continued their freewheeling style of recording. They were still attempting to undermine the glossy production of Pepper that was already legendary. With the White Album now the best-selling album of the 60s, it seemed to be working. But when they were presented with the mixes of Get Back, they were so disappointed they abandoned the whole project. Collectively, the four Beatles decided to revert back to, in McCartney's words, the way they used to do it. After the implosion of Get Back, they would use the rubble from the disaster to rebuild in its place. It would be the first album since Pepper critics would universally praise, but it was not without serious issues. Lennon at this point had developed an addiction to heroin. He'd also sanded the paint off his Epiphone Casino on the advice of Donovan in order to improve the sound. George had found new confidence in his music. He asserted himself in the studio and threw caution to the wind. Paul was now the only one of the four who still cared about being a Beatle. He still valued producer George Martin's input, whereas by this point the others couldn't care less. The Abbey Road sessions would see a tug of war in musical styles, a return to Beatles of old, and for the first and only time in history, a bed will be set up in Studio 2. This is the story of the Beatles' Abbey Road. By 1969, psychedelic rock was in retreat. LSD, long been made illegal in the US and the UK by this point, and research into its medical use had been shut down.
I got the hot dog up to my mouth again, and I was ready to bite, and the scream got louder, and I looked down at the hot dog, and there was a face on him. And he started telling me that I couldn't eat him, that he had a wife and 7 kids at home to support.
The psychedelic movement would climax that year with the Woodstock Festival and see the hippie dream turn into a nightmare with the Manson family murders. It was disastrous for the counterculture, with an anti-hippie backlash now in full force. As the year begins with the Beatles at breaking point, the solution, in Paul's mind at least, was simple. Get back to what they were, 4 musicians performing live. The others, though reluctant, agreed to film a live TV show. Basically, something like what they did with the Hey Jude performance. They met in January at Twickenham Studios where they rehearsed for the live performance. All was not going well, and George decided he didn't want to be recorded while rehearsing, he didn't want to perform live, and he didn't want to be in the Beatles. After a short break, he returned, but not to Twickenham. The Beatles had now moved to the new basement studios in which their friend and head of Apple Electronics, Magic Alex Mardas, had built them. The Beatles at this point were desperate for their own studio. They couldn't stand booking time any longer. They wanted instant access to record day or night, and they didn't want to have to wait for other acts. They also felt, as EMI's head act, they should have priority. This led to a studio being built in Apple's basement. Unfortunately, the studio was a disaster. The mixing console astounded the engineers. Magic Alex had made it from bits of wood and an old oscilloscope. It hadn't been properly designed and machined together. Alex had banged it together with a hammer and chisel. When John Lennon first saw it, he was not impressed. He stated it looked like something out of a 1930s science fiction movie. They tried a session, but it produced unacceptable amounts of hiss and hum. Lynn Johns stated, "I can't make a record with this board." The board was sold as scrap for £5 to a second-hand electronics shop. But it wasn't just the mixing console. The whole studio was found to be completely unworkable. It was in such a state, nothing could be salvaged. Everything was gutted and rebuilt from the ground up. Harrison later stated, having Magic Alex design the studio was the biggest disaster of all time. Jeff Emerick, who'd left during the White Album, agreed to return at this point. The whole operation of building a new studio was taken out of Alex's hands and placed into Emerick's. Glyn Johns at this time was producing the band. As for George Martin, it was unclear exactly how much involvement he had with Get Back. He was there for some sessions, absent for others. Alan Klein, the ruthless New York banker, had been hired mainly through the encouragement of John. He'd taken over Apple offices, firing anyone he could and forcing many others to resign. The beginning of Abbey Road and the completion of Get Back overlap, with sessions for Abbey Road technically beginning February 22nd. It would actually be in July when serious efforts for the album will begin. The sessions at Trident Studios begin with John's song I Want You. Later the words She's So Heavy would be added to the title. Originally, John's plan was to record a song with only one lyric. In the end, he settled with 15. They worked on the song through the night. 35 tracks were recorded from 8 PM to 5 AM. At one point during the sessions, Paul can be heard singing the lead vocal as an experiment. 3 takes of the song recorded on this day will be edited together for the master with overdubs later. During later mixing, Lennon will tell Emmerich to cut the song dead instead of fading out, bringing it and the first side of Abbey Road to an immediate end. After the group had laid down the basic track, it was normally the writer of the song who would lay down overdubs. In other words, they really had no interest in being a unit anymore. I Want You, She's So Heavy was the first song they worked on and the last song to be mixed. After the mix, the Beatles will never set foot in a studio together again. 25th of February, George turns 26 and attends Abbey Road alone to record a few demos. That day, he records Old Brown Shoe, All Things Must Pass and Something. At this point, producer Glyn Johns presents the group with a rough copy of the Get Back songs. When Paul and John hear it, they are displeased. They ask him to do a full mix of the songs. With free reign over the Get Back tapes, on the 10th of March, Johns begins mixing. Over the months, he will go through each song in Olympic Studios, picking out the best of the shoddy Get Back tapes. The group at this point decided, in George's words, let's make a good album. They discard their unconventional recording style, now wanting an album with carefully crafted songs and diligent production. Paul phones George Martin and tells him, "We're going to make another record, would you like to produce it?" Hesitant Martin responds, "Only if we do it the way we used to." Paul confirms this is what they all want, and so George Martin casts aside his memories of the Beatles' last 2 albums and has images of a grand Rubber Soul Revolver production for their next record. In reality, George Martin would never really gain back control over the Beatles. That was gone, and it would never be returning. Rejuvenated on April 14th, John and Paul return to Abbey Road with neither Ringo, who's filming The Magic Christian, or George, who is out the country. The two were in great spirits, relaxed and content. At this point, longtime sound engineer Jeff Emmerich returns to the studio. Though wary of Lennon's temper, Peter Brown has assured him, John's fine now. The two record the Beatles' next single, The Ballad of John and Yoko, with George Martin, Jeff Emmerich and Yoko Ono watching on in the control room. John plays his Gibson and Paul accompanies him on Ringo's Ludwig Hollywood drum kit. All goes well and the two Beatles plan to have Emmerich work on their next album. This was not exactly an honour for him. To some, it's regarded as a punishment. The Beatles still have a bad reputation to work with. When a sound engineer is later assigned to work on Abbey Road, he protests, "Why me?" Nevertheless, the sessions couldn't have gone better. Emmerich later stated, "It was a great session, one of those magic times when everything went right and nothing went wrong." When George Harrison returns from the States, he's eager to continue work on the demos he'd recorded. The biggest change of the four by this point was George Harrison. He was far more confident and self-assured about his music. They begin laying down tracks for his song Old Brown Shoe. At one point, George is told to turn his guitar down by an engineer because they're picking up feedback. George replies, "You don't talk to a Beatle like that." After several takes, they move on to George's song, Something. In the studio, they now rarely mention the name Magic Alex. His disastrous attempt to building them a recording studio had left his future with them uncertain. As a matter of fact, they rarely even mention the new studio being built either. The sessions continue, and it doesn't take long for arguments to begin. This may be because the four were now rarely in the same room as each other. Despite this, the arguments blow over quickly. Each of the four are on their best behaviour. For the group, this would mean sometimes just staying out of each other's way. By the 18th of April, George has completed his song Old Brown Shoe. It will never appear on the album. Following this, work continues on I Want You and Paul's song Oh Darling. Paul's song was originally titled I'll Never Do You No Harm. At this point, George, who also owned an Epiphone casino, and Paul, who owned a Rickenbacker bass, had too sanded down their instruments. Paul's Rickenbacker had previously been spray painted while he was tripping on LSD. He stated, "It looks great on acid. You look at your guitar and you trip even more." Years later, he'd now sanded all the paint off. George Harrison agreed with Donovan's theory that if you take the paint off certain guitars, it seems to improve the sound. As the sessions continue, other engineers who'd never worked with the Beatles are told by George Martin, "There's one Beatle, fine, two Beatles, great, three Beatles, fantastic, but the minute the four of them are all there, that is when the unexplained magic happens." Sure enough, others would later attest to Martin's words. By early May, the group were working on Ringo's song Octopus's Garden. Ringo had written the song in 1968 while on a yacht in the Mediterranean. He was eating squid and chips when the captain informed him octopuses collect rocks and tin cans and put them outside their underwater caves to form a garden. Ringo was always spending time in his own garden, and so that was the inspiration for the song. On the album's release, the song was referred to as a poor man's Yellow Submarine. At this point, Chris Thomas, George Martin's protege, was filling in for him while he was away. Paul began laying down vocals for his song Oh Darling. Thomas was expecting an incredible performance. He believed Paul was the greatest rock and roll singer in the world. He was shocked to hear a lackluster vocal. He questioned Paul during the session, to which Paul replied, "I can't sing like that anymore. You know, I'm older now." In later sessions, he would nail the vocal. Thomas went away believing Paul just simply couldn't be bothered anymore. Following this, they concentrated for days on George's song Something. They all knew it was a great song, despite the fact they never really said anything. An engineer later said, "You could always tell how they felt by the expression on their face." At this point, George Harrison began asserting himself in the studio. For the first time, he gave Paul direction on how to play the bass, possibly revenge for all the direction he'd received from Paul. When working on Here Comes the Sun, Paul begins suggesting changes on the song, to which George will cut him off, saying, "No, I think the song's fine as it is." When Paul continues, George snaps, "Look, I don't have to listen to you." George Martin later stated, Here Comes the Sun was the first time George Harrison really came through with a brilliant composition. Afterwards, they begin work on Paul's new song, You Never Give Me Your Money, written about the infamous Alan Klein. On May 9th, an argument begins when Lennon, Harrison and Ringo demand Paul sign a contract appointing Alan Klein as their new manager. Paul refuses, and it aggravates the others, especially John. They storm out of the studio swearing at Paul, leaving him alone, and recording for Abbey Road comes to a halt. Days later, the Beatles regroup to take photos for the Get Back album. Glyn Johns and George Martin are still remixing at this point. After the photo session ends, the band go their separate ways. Paul goes to Corfu, George travels to Sardinia, Ringo to New York, and John holds his first bed-in. On May 30th, a final mix of Get Back is complete. The finished album Get Back contains countings and mistakes. George Martin feels it's a write-off and declares, "That's the end of the Beatles, what a shame." Midway through June, Paul contacts George Martin and tells him the group will soon be ready to start recording again. July 1st, Paul arrives at Abbey Road alone. He later learns John has been in a driving accident in Scotland. George Martin remarks, "What a fine way to start the project." Over the next few days, work begins on Paul's mini opera. The sessions are quite peaceful with John's absence. Unfortunately, a new mixing console at Abbey Road means they can never recreate the old Beatles sound. The old mixing console had been tube circuitry, whereas the new one was transistor circuitry. As the days go by, they get updates on John's progress. On the 7th of July, Ringo turns 29 and they continue work on George's song Here Comes the Sun. 2 days later, John returns to the studio and Paul's Love It or Hate It song Maxwell's Silver Hammer begins. Unfortunately, George and John both hate it. John arrives in the studio with Yoko, both dressed in black. John appears bruised and the worse for wear. He assures everyone he's fine and tells them he's brought back the smashed up car with him. He'd had the car towed to Abbey Road's parking lot before it was taken to Tittenhurst. As they're talking, Yoko grabs his sleeve and grunts. John then states, "I'm afraid that Mother is still not well." At that moment, 4 delivery men wearing Harrods logo enter the studio carting a large object. It looks to be a piano, but on closer inspection, they're wheeling in a bed frame. The delivery men then set up a bed next to the stairs in Studio 2. With the sheets and pillows arranged, Yoko climbs into the bed, while Paul, Ringo and George look on speechless. Ellen then walks over to Yoko and asks her if she's okay. She gives him the thumbs up, and then John instructs Jeff Emmerich to get a microphone to her so the Beatles can hear her through their headphones. With all 4 Beatles now present, they continue work on Maxwell's Silver Hammer. The song had came from the karmic idea that if you do something wrong, Maxwell's Silver Hammer will come down on your head. John refused to participate. He just sat on Yoko's bed watching the others. He dismissed the song as more of Paul's granny music. At one point, Paul walks over to the bed and tries to get him involved. John brushes him off, stating, "No, I don't think so." For the next few weeks, Yoko will be laying in the bed as the group record. She regains her strength slowly and begins to greatly annoy the other Beatles and George Martin. Through the microphone, Yoko would speak in a very light voice and would refer to them in a third-party way, like, "Beatles will do this, Beatles will do that." This aggravates Paul and he begins correcting her, saying, "It's the Beatles, love." Yoko ignores him and continues to call them Beatles. As they continue work on Oh Darling and Octopus's Garden, a stream of people visiting Yoko interrupt their concentration. Basically, instead of being in hospital and having visitors, the whole setup had been transported to Studio 2. This, along with John's bad mood, made for a terrible atmosphere. As recording goes on, there's little interaction from John, who spends most of his time in the corner whispering to Yoko or off making phone calls. George Martin wishes John will get more involved. Occasionally, Paul's wife Linda drops by to take a few photos before leaving. She never outstays her welcome or gets under anyone's feet. July 21st, after weeks of moping around, John comes into the studio and announces, "Okay lads, I'm ready. Time to let your hair down and do some rock and roll." they begin work on John's new song Come Together. During the sessions, they keep breaking off into pointless jams. John records all the vocals himself. George isn't bothered, but this aggravates Paul. This day, Paul leaves the studio early for one of the first times ever. At this point in 1969, the Apollo 11 lands on the moon. The Beatles all watch it live. To their disappointment, it's broadcasted in black and white. After this, they begin work on The End, the closing track to Abbey Road. As they're listening to the playback in the control room, George looks out of the window to see Yoko has got out of her bed and she's eating one of his digestive biscuits. George shouts, "That bitch! She's just taken one of my biscuits!" Lennon begins shouting back at George, but he doesn't have a leg to stand on in this argument. The argument soon turns to the bed, with George stating, "If Yoko's well enough to get out of bed and eat one of my biscuits, she doesn't need to be in the bed in the first place." The argument blows over and Paul begins trying to convince Ringo to do a drum solo for the song. Ringo hates drum solos, but he's eventually convinced. The second half of Abbey Road would bring the biggest conflict between Paul, George and John. The mini rock opera that ended the album had been Paul's invention. John hated it. He didn't see anything artistic in it. He thought it was just bits of songs thrown together. Ringo sided with Paul. He stated, "The last section for me is one of the greatest things we ever did." Who's right is down to the listener, but one thing is for sure, a lot of work went into it. The next session begins with an argument about the planned mini opera. John feels they've already done the concept idea with Pepper. George Martin reasons it's the best way to use all the unfinished songs they have. John still doesn't like the idea, but when it's suggested they use some of his unfinished songs, he changes his mind. Following this, they record John's contributions, Sun King and Mean Mr. Mustard. Both of them are recorded together. John was feeling better by this point and Yoko was out of her bed, though it still sits there unmade in Studio 2. Before recording the pseudo-Spanish gibberish at the end of Sun King, John and Paul disappear to smoke marijuana. When they return, they find it difficult to contain their laughter laying down the vocal. The mood begins to turn sour when they begin their next session recording John's song Polythene Pam and Paul's song She Came In Through the Bathroom Window. Tensions arise when John isn't happy with Ringo's drumming. Impatient as ever, John doesn't want to wait too long for him to find a rhythm that works and declares, "Sod it, let's just put one down." They record the backing track, but Ringo continues to work out patterns with Paul. He then approaches John and says, "Why don't we just record the backing again? I think I've got a part you'll like now." John snaps back at Ringo, "I'm not playing the bloody song again, Ring." That night, Ringo overdubs the new drums. When later mixing the song Sun King, John suggests the song start immediately after You Never Give Me Your Money. Paul disagrees and wants the listener more time to ease into Sun King. Paul brings in sounds of crickets and bells, and they are eventually used for the transition. As George Martin listens to the playback one night in the studio, he remarks, "You'd never guess the four of them actually can't stand each other." At this point, they decide to use Paul's song Her Majesty to play 20 seconds after the album finishes. Following that, they recorded two Paul compositions, Golden Slumbers and Carry That Weight. They then begin John's song Because. They spend hours and hours working out the complex harmonies with George Martin on piano. John had originally written it on guitar, but for the record they would play it on harpsichord. They recorded the harmonies together with Paul conducting them using hand gestures. It takes 5 hours to get the vocals down. John gets snappy with Paul at one point saying, "Jesus Christ, give me a break already. I wish I hadn't written the bloody thing. Interestingly, according to Jeff Emerick, even though Ringo wasn't singing harmony, he sat close by with his eyes closed, concentrating, almost telepathically contributing. Finally, they just have to finish off an end sequence to their song, The End. George Harrison states, "Well, a guitar solo is the obvious thing." John adds jokingly, "But this time you should let me play it." Then John states, "Why don't we all play the solo? We can take turns and trade licks." Paul loves the idea, but George is unsure. Paul then adds, "Why don't we do it live too?" All three of them agree. As the guitars are being set up, the three Beatles sit in the control room and Paul insists he play the first solo. As it's his song, the others agree. Yoko, as ever, was sat by John's side. As John gets up to walk down to Studio 2, he turns to her for the first time and says, "Wait there, love, I won't be a minute." The three record their solos over the next hour. The engineers crafted a distinct sound for each guitar so the listener could easily distinguish between them. With the last track finished, Abbey Road is complete. When they had first started the album, Abbey Road either would have been the spark that rejuvenated them or the last nail in their coffin. It ended up as both. Ironically, the success they found in returning to their previous structure confirmed the sad truth not even this could rekindle their relationship. They were originally going to title the album Everest, four Beatles climbing back to their peak, but they couldn't name an album after a cigarette packet, so it became Abbey Road, a symbol of them returning to their glory days. Unfortunately, to anyone watching closely, John, mentally, had already left the Beatles. In fact, that had begun with the White Album. Despite this, Abbey Road was remembered fondly by the group. George Martin later stated, "Abbey Road was a very, very happy album. Everybody worked frightfully well, and that's why I'm so fond of it."
Thank you to everyone who supports the channel. If you wish to donate, it would be greatly appreciated as this is my main source of income. Just click the three symbols next to the video, then the thanks icon, and however much you wish to donate. Thanks for watching and stay tuned for my next video.